Mark thought he was cleaning the house. He called her a charity case and a burden on his ambition. He watched her walk into the rain with nothing but the clothes on her back and a dusty plastic card tucked in her pocket. And in that moment, he was absolutely certain he had won. But somewhere across the city, in a glass tower with marble floors and armed security on every level, the CEO of one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world was staring at a computer screen with shaking hands. His face had gone pale. His coffee sat untouched. And with a voice barely above a whisper, he picked up his radio and said 4 words that would change everything. "Lock the doors," he said. "Nobody let that woman leave this building." Today, as we pull back the curtain on a betrayal that spanned 3 generations and a secret legacy that was never meant to be found. Before we go any further, take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We genuinely love hearing from our community, and we don't want you to miss a single one of our upcoming stories. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that bank vault, you need to understand where Elena came from, and more importantly, what had been hidden from her for nearly 30 years. Elena Vasquez was born in a small Rust Belt town in western Pennsylvania called Clairton, a place that had once hummed with the sound of steel mills and working-class pride. But by the time Elena arrived into the world in the spring of 1987, the mills had gone quiet, and the streets had gone tired. Her mother, Rosa, was a woman of extraordinary quiet strength. The kind of woman who stretched a dollar so far it nearly tore, who worked double shifts at a diner 6 days a week, and who still somehow found the energy to braid Elena's hair every single morning before school. Rosa never talked about money. She never talked about the past. And she absolutely, under no circumstances, ever talked about Elena's grandfather. His name was Thomas Vasquez, and that name, in Rosa's house, was the closest thing to a curse word there was. Elena learned early that asking about Thomas was the fastest way to watch her mother's face close like a door. So she stopped asking. She learned to read the silence. She learned to build a life out of what was right in front of her, and what was right in front of her was never very much. A 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, a second-hand school uniform, a mother who loved her fiercely, and a father who had never once shown up. That was Elena's world, and she made peace with it. She was practical that way. She was the kind of person who showed up early and stayed late, who never expected handouts, who believed that if you worked hard enough and kept your head down long enough, the world would eventually notice you. And for a while, it seemed like it did. Elena won a partial scholarship to the University of Pittsburgh when she was 18, studied accounting because it felt stable and honest, and graduated with honors in 2009, right into the teeth of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The job market was a wasteland. She sent out over 200 applications in her first year out of college. She got 11 interviews. She got 0 offers. She moved back in with Rosa. She worked at a tax preparation office during filing season and tutored high school kids in math the rest of the year. And she told herself it was temporary, that this was just a chapter, that the next one would be better. The next chapter arrived in the form of a man named Mark Ellison. She met him at a community fundraiser in Pittsburgh's East End neighborhood, one of those events where local businesses sponsor tables and everyone dresses slightly nicer than they normally would. Mark was there representing his father's real estate development firm. He was tall, angular, with sharp blue eyes, and the kind of easy confidence that comes not from self-awareness, but from never having been told no. He was charming in that particular way that very entitled people often are when they want something. attentive, flattering, full of questions about you rather than stories about himself. Elena, who had spent most of her adult life being overlooked, found it intoxicating. She told herself she was being careful. She wasn't. They dated for 2 years. In those 2 years, Elena noticed things. Small things at first. The kind you talk yourself out of noticing. The way he would subtly redirect conversations away from her accomplishments. The way he referred to her job, her neighborhood, to her background with a kind of benevolent tolerance, as though he were generously ignoring her deficiencies. The way his family, the Ellisons, seemed to regard her as a pleasant but temporary arrangement. A phase Mark was going through, like the semester he'd spent backpacking through Europe. But she loved him, or she believed she did, and she believed that love was something you built through patience and commitment, and showing up. So she showed up. She showed up every single day. They moved in together into a brownstone in Shadyside that Mark's father had purchased as an investment property. Mark worked at the family firm. Elena got a job at a mid-size accounting firm downtown. Not glamorous, but steady. And she paid half the household expenses every month. Always on time. Always to the penny. She built that home with her own hands, not literally, but in every way that actually mattered. She was the one who remembered their friends' birthdays. She was the one who knew the name of the building superintendent and his daughter's soccer schedule. She was the one who turned a house into something that felt like it meant something. And Mark let her. He more than let her. He quietly came to depend on her in ways he would never have admitted out loud, because admitting dependence would have required a level of self-awareness he simply did not possess. The cracks appeared gradually, then all at once. It was his father, Richard Ellison, who first openly voiced what the family had apparently been thinking for some time. See, at a dinner at the Ellison home in Fox Chapel, a dinner Elena had helped plan and had brought a homemade dessert to, Richard pulled Mark aside in the kitchen and said, loudly enough that Elena could hear from the hallway, that it was time for Mark to start thinking seriously about his future, about the kind of woman who would actually be an asset to his career, to his legacy. He did not say Elena's name. He didn't have to. The implication was a blade, and it landed exactly where it was aimed. Mark said nothing to defend her. Elena stood in that hallway with a serving dish in her hands and understood something she had been refusing to understand for a very long time. But she stayed. She stayed for another 8 months because she had built something, and she was not the kind of person who walked away from things she had built. Oh, she stayed until Mark came home one Tuesday evening in March and told her, with an almost administrative detachment, that it wasn't working, that they wanted different things, that she needed to find somewhere else to stay. He used the phrase, burden on my ambition. She would remember that phrase for the rest of her life, the clinical precision of it, the way it reduced everything she had given to a line item on a ledger. He gave her 2 weeks to gather her things. She gathered them in 2 days. She left on a Thursday evening in the rain, a single cardboard box in her arms, the brownstone door closing behind her with the weight of a verdict. She had $43 in her checking account. She had a bag of clothes, a box of books, and tucked in the inside pocket of her winter coat, and something she had almost forgotten about entirely. A small, dusty plastic card that Rosa had pressed into her hand 3 years earlier at Christmas, with no explanation beyond the words, "Keep this safe. Don't lose it. One day it might matter." Elena had looked at it then, seen nothing on it but a long account number, a routing number, and the name of a bank she didn't recognize, and had filed it away as one of Rosa's eccentricities. She had not thought about it since. She thought about it now, standing in the rain outside Mark's brownstone, with nowhere to be and nothing to lose. She stayed the first 2 nights at the apartment of her friend Denise, a woman she had known since college, the kind of friend who asks no questions and makes no judgments and simply hands you a towel and a cup of tea and lets you fall apart in peace. Your Denise worked nights at a hospital, so Elena had the apartment to herself during the days, and she used those days to do what she had always done in moments of crisis. She got organized. She updated her resume. She started applying for accounting positions again. She opened a spreadsheet and mapped out exactly how long her savings could sustain her at minimum expenses. The answer was approximately 6 weeks. She set a deadline of 4 weeks to have at least one solid job prospect in play. She was methodical. She was composed. But at night, alone in Denise's spare room, she let herself feel the full weight of what had happened to her. And it was considerable. On her 4th day at Denise's apartment, with nothing else to do in the early morning hours, she found the plastic card in her coat pocket and turned it over in her fingers. And there was a small logo on the back she hadn't noticed before. A logo that, after a few minutes of searching online, she identified as belonging to a private banking institution based in Philadelphia called Meridian Trust. Not a name she knew. Not a bank she had ever walked past or seen advertised. Meridian Trust did not have retail branches. It did not offer checking accounts to walk-in customers. It did not have a consumer-facing website with a mortgage calculator and a chatbot. What it had was a 3-digit phone number printed on the back of the card, a representative availability line, and a reputation, one that Elena had to dig fairly deep into the internet to find, as one of the oldest private wealth management institutions on the East Coast, the kind of bank that existed to serve a very specific, a very small clientele whose assets were measured not in thousands or tens of thousands, but in generational terms. Elena stared at the card for a long time. She thought about Rosa. She thought about Thomas Vasquez, the name that had never been spoken, the door that had always been closed. She thought about the way Rosa had handed her the card with that strange, weighted instruction, "Keep it safe. One day it might matter." And she understood, perhaps for the first time, that Rosa had known something. Rosa had been protecting something. And Rosa, who had passed away 14 months earlier from a heart attack at 61, working a shift she never should have been working, had never gotten the chance to tell Elena what it was. She called the number on the back of the card. The phone rang twice before a human voice answered. Not a recorded menu, not a hold queue, a person, a real person with a measured professional cadence who asked for her name and the account number on the card. Elena gave both. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then the voice said, "Miss Vasquez, we have been waiting for your call. I need to ask you a few security verification questions, and then I would like to schedule an in-person appointment at our Philadelphia office at your earliest possible convenience. Would tomorrow morning work for you?" Elena said yes before she had fully processed what was happening. She took the Greyhound to Philadelphia the next morning, which was a Friday in late March, gray and cold. The kind of day that felt like the city was holding its breath. The Meridian Trust offices were on the 11th floor of a building on Walnut Street, in the kind of neighborhood where the coffee shops don't post prices in the window because the clientele doesn't need to see them. The elevator opened into a reception area that was quiet and carpeted and smelled like old wood and fresh flowers, and a woman in a navy blazer met Elena at the door, shook her hand warmly, and walked her not to a waiting area, but directly into a private conference room where 2 men in dark suits were already seated at the table. The first man introduced himself as Gerald Marsh, Director of Account Services at Meridian Trust. The second man, who was older, gray-haired, and wore an expression of careful professional neutrality, introduced himself as James Calloway, general counsel for the Meridian Trust Estate Division. There was a thick manila folder on the table between them. Gerald Marsh placed his hands flat on the table, looked at Elena directly, and said, "Miss Vasquez, what I'm about to tell you is going to be a great deal to process. I want to ask you to please hear everything before you respond. Is that all right?" Elena, who had spent the entire 4-hour bus ride preparing herself for something significant without being able to imagine what it might be, said yes. She was still wearing her winter coat. She had not had breakfast. What Gerald Marsh told her over the next 45 minutes was this. Thomas Vasquez, Elena's grandfather, the name that had been a closed door her entire life, had not been the man Rosa had protected Elena from. He had been the man Rosa had been protecting Elena for. Your Thomas Vasquez had emigrated from Puerto Rico to New York City in 1952 at the age of 22 with $17 and a suitcase, and over the following 4 decades, through a combination of intelligence, timing, and a particular genius for understanding real estate cycles, before they were obvious to anyone else, he had built a property portfolio spanning parts of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and northern New Jersey that by the time of his death in 1998 had grown into something that required professional management teams and teams of attorneys to properly administer. Thomas had 2 children. His son, Victor Vasquez, Rosa's brother, had been incorporated into the family business from a young age and had been the public face of the Vasquez holdings for most of his adult life. Rosa had been the quieter child, and the one who married young and moved to Pennsylvania, the one who had, in the language of Thomas's generation, made her own way. Thomas had respected Rosa's independence deeply. He had also, apparently, never forgiven himself for not doing more to support her when her marriage fell apart, and she found herself alone with a young daughter in a declining industrial town, working herself half to death at a diner. He had tried to help. Rosa had refused. Their relationship had been loving but complicated, built on mutual stubbornness and the particular kind of pain that lives between people who love each other but can't quite reach each other across the distance of pride. In 1995, 3 years before his death, Thomas had established a trust, the Vasquez Legacy Trust, administered by Meridian Trust and funded with a carefully selected portion of his real estate assets. The trust was not for Victor. Victor was already provided for, already incorporated, already the heir apparent to the main holdings. The trust was for Rosa, or more specifically, it was for Rosa's daughter. The child Thomas had never properly met, but had, according to the documents Gerald Marsh now slid across the table toward Elena, thought about every single day for the last decade of his life. He had structured the trust specifically to activate on Elena's 35th birthday. The theory, according to a handwritten letter Thomas had left with the Meridian Trust attorneys, it being that 35 was old enough to have learned something about the world, but young enough to still do something meaningful with what you'd learned. Elena's 35th birthday had been 11 months ago. She had not known to call. No one knew how to find her. And Rosa, the one person who had known about the card and the number, had died before she'd found the courage to explain it. The value of the trust at current assessment, Gerald Marsh told her, was not a number Elena had any existing framework for processing. It was not a comfortable cushion. It was not a down payment on a house. It was a number with 8 figures, structured across a portfolio of properties, diversified investments, and a cash account that had been sitting in readiness at Meridian Trust for 11 months, accumulating interest, waiting for her. See, Elena sat very still in her chair for a long time after Gerald finished speaking. James Calloway, the attorney, pushed a box of tissues across the table in her direction with the practiced discretion of a man who had done this before. She did not use them. She looked at the folder on the table. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at Gerald Marsh and said, "I need to understand every single part of this before I sign anything." Gerald Marsh nodded and said, "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say." Now here is where this story turns, because what Elena did next was not what you might expect. She did not call a real estate agent. She did not call a luxury car dealership. She did not post anything on social media. She called Denise. She told her she needed to stay in the spare room for a few more weeks. She told her something had come up that required her full attention, and that she would explain more when she understood it herself. Then she spent the next 3 weeks at Denise's apartment, reading every document Gerald Marsh had sent her, building spreadsheets, mapping the portfolio, understanding the asset classes, learning the structures. She hired an independent financial attorney, not one recommended by Meridian Trust, but one she found herself, a woman named Patricia Cole, who had a reputation for representing clients against institutional interests. And she had Patricia review every line of every document before she touched a single dollar. What Patricia found in those documents, buried in the administrative history of the trust, was something that neither Gerald Marsh nor James Calloway had volunteered. It was an amendment. An amendment filed in 2003, 5 years after Thomas's death, in the name of Victor Vasquez. The amendment did not change the beneficiary of the trust. It could not. Thomas had been very deliberate about making that legally bulletproof. What it did do was restructure the disbursement timeline in a way that, had Elena not been found within a specific legal window, would have triggered a clause that redirected a significant portion of the interest accumulation into a separate foundation, controlled, nominally, by Victor's estate. The window had been Elena's 35th birthday. She was found 11 months later. But she had been found in time. The Vasquez Legacy Trust, as designed by Thomas, protected his granddaughter regardless. But the amendment told a story. It told the story of a man, Victor Vasquez, who had known about this trust. He had known about Elena, had known about the card Rosa was supposed to deliver and explain, and had done nothing to help Elena find it. He had, in fact, done something closer to the opposite. Patricia dug further. She found correspondence, internal emails obtained through a subsequent legal process, showing that Victor's attorneys had been aware of Elena's last known address in Pittsburgh as recently as 4 years ago. The same address where Rosa had still been living. They had not contacted her. They had not contacted Rosa. They had waited. They had restructured what they could restructure, repositioned what they could reposition, and waited for the clock to run out. Elena read all of this in Denise's spare room on a Wednesday night, with a cup of cold coffee beside her. And she felt something she would later describe as a very specific kind of clarity. The kind that comes not from anger, though anger was there, but from the total and complete removal of any remaining uncertainty about what kind of world she was operating in and what kind of person she needed to be to operate in it. She was not surprised. That was perhaps the most telling part. She was not surprised that someone had tried to take something from her. She had been navigating a world that tried to take things from people like her entire life. What was different now was that she had something to fight back with. She had Patricia Cole. She had Meridian Trust's institutional obligation to protect the trust's integrity. And she had Thomas's letter. The letter was the thing nobody had fully prepared her for. It had been included in the documents but filed toward the back of the folder, and Elena had not gotten to it until her second full read-through of everything. It was 3 pages, handwritten in Thomas's careful, slightly formal script, and it was addressed to "My granddaughter, whoever you are by the time you read this." It began with an apology. Not the kind of apology that excuses itself as it goes, not the kind that pivots quickly to justification. but a real one, the kind that sits in its own weight without flinching. Thomas wrote that he had made choices in his life that he was proud of, and choices he was ashamed of, and that the choice he was most ashamed of was the distance he had allowed to grow between himself and Rosa, on a distance built from his own pride and his own assumptions about what strength looked like and what love required. He wrote that Rosa was the best of the people he had raised, and that whatever Rosa's daughter had turned out to be, he was confident she had inherited the things that actually mattered. He wrote, "You are reading this because you found the card. I hope the road that brought you here was not too hard. I suspect it was hard. The roads our family travels tend to be hard. But if you are here, you survived it. And that means you are ready." Elena read that paragraph 4 times. The 5th time she read it, she was crying. Not with grief, exactly, though grief was part of it, but with something more complicated. The particular emotion that lives at the intersection of loss and recognition knew the feeling of being known by someone who is no longer there to know you. She accepted the trust in full on a Tuesday morning in April, 63 days after she had walked out of Mark Ellison's brownstone in the rain. She signed the documents, with Patricia Cole beside her and Gerald Marsh and James Calloway across the table. And when Gerald slid the final page toward her, and she signed her name, and he said, "Welcome, Miss Vasquez. The account is now in your hands," she looked up from the paper and said, "What happens now?" And Gerald Marsh, who had been doing this for 30 years and had learned not to attach his own emotions to his client's moments, allowed himself a small, genuine smile and said, "Now, Miss Vasquez, you decide." What she decided was characteristically methodical and characteristically hers. How she did not move to a penthouse, she did not buy a flashy car. She rented a quiet 1-bedroom apartment in Philadelphia's Fairmount neighborhood, furnished it simply, and spent 6 months working with Patricia Cole and a team of financial advisors she had assembled herself, carefully vetted, independently hired, to fully understand and stabilize the portfolio she had inherited. She learned the properties. She visited them. She walked the streets of the neighborhoods where Thomas Vasquez's building stood, and she talked to tenants and property managers and community members, and she understood not just the financial architecture of what she had inherited, but the human architecture, the lives that were adjacent to it, the responsibilities that came with it. She also, during those 6 months, built a legal case. And it was not a criminal case. Victor Vasquez's maneuvering, while deeply calculated and morally indefensible, had been structured carefully enough to stay on the right side of legality, or close enough to it that criminal prosecution would have been difficult and drawn out. What Elena and Patricia built instead was a civil action, a carefully documented argument that Victor's 2003 amendment had been filed in bad faith with the intent to disadvantage a beneficiary whose existence and location were known to him, and that this constituted a breach of fiduciary duty to the trust. The case took 18 months to resolve. Victor's attorneys, who had clearly not anticipated that Elena would show up with her own team, her own evidence, and a forensic accountant who had spent 3 decades building cases against exactly this kind of institutional maneuvering, fought hard. They did not win. The settlement was not disclosed publicly. The financial terms, as is standard in these cases, were sealed. But the amendment was reversed. The clause was struck, and Victor Vasquez's access to any portion of the Vasquez Legacy Trust, however it had been structured, was terminated permanently and irrevocably. Elena had not gone looking for a fight, but when one was brought to her family, to her grandfather's intentions, to her mother's sacrifice, she did not look away from it either. Here is the part of the story that does not get told in the way it should be. Here is the part that tends to get summarized in a sentence. or left out entirely because it does not fit neatly into the arc of triumph. During those 18 months of legal proceedings, Elena was also grieving. She was grieving Rosa. She was grieving the version of her childhood that might have existed if Rosa had opened the door instead of protecting her from it. She was grieving the years of scarcity that had been, in some measure, optional. Not because Thomas had intended them to be. Not because Rosa had been wrong to value independence, but because the gap between what was and what might have been is a real place, and it requires real grief to walk through it. She was also, in the quieter hours, grieving the version of herself that had stood in the rain outside Mark Ellison's brownstone, believing that she was the problem in that equation. That version of her was not entirely wrong about the world. She had known all along that the world was structured to disadvantage people like her. What she had not fully known, until Thomas's letter, was that she had also always been held. Even when it felt like she had nothing, someone had been holding a place for her. She thought about Mark sometimes, not often, and not in the way she once had. She thought about him the way you think about a closed chapter, not with longing, not with hatred, but with the particular equanimity that comes when you understand that a painful thing also moved you, however harshly, in a necessary direction. She did not contact him. She had nothing to say to him. If Mark Ellison ever learned what had happened, and given how Philadelphia's private financial circles work, it was reasonable to assume he eventually did, he was free to sit with whatever that knowledge produced in him. That was not her concern. Her concern was the portfolio, and more specifically, her concern became what to do with the portfolio in a way that would have made Thomas proud, and, more importantly, would have made Rosa proud, because Elena understood something about her grandfather that she had taken months to properly articulate. Thomas Vasquez had built wealth, but what he had wanted to pass down was not the wealth itself. It was freedom. He had wanted to hand Elena, a woman he had never met, a granddaughter born in a declining town to a stubborn and fiercely loving mother, the freedom to make choices that were not constrained by survival. The money was the instrument. Freedom was the point. And Elena, who had spent 35 years making every decision through the lens of survival, who had learned to stretch dollars and hedge risks and keep her head down and her expectations calibrated, was now going to have to learn something fundamentally new. She was going to have to learn how to think big. She started with housing, not luxury housing, not the kind of development the Ellison firm built in neighborhoods that had already been gentrified, but workforce housing, the kind that actually makes a difference to the kind of people Rosa had been, the kind Elena had been. She partnered with a community development organization in western Pennsylvania, invested in 3 mixed-income residential projects in Pittsburgh and Allentown, and hired a development team that had a track record of building things that stayed affordable, that served communities rather than extracting from them. She did not put her name on buildings. She was not interested in putting her name on things. She was interested in the buildings working. She established a scholarship fund specifically for first-generation college students in accounting, finance, and business. Students who, like her, had the aptitude and the work ethic, but not the cushion, the ones who graduated into recessions and moved back in with their parents, and told themselves it was temporary. The scholarship covered not just tuition, but living expenses, and the thing that almost no scholarship covers, and the thing that actually determines whether a student makes it through. She called it the Rosa Vasquez Fund. She did not hold a press conference. She released a 1-paragraph statement to the Pittsburgh Business Times and went back to work. In the late spring of 2 years after the night she had walked out into the rain, Elena Vasquez sat in a window seat of a coffee shop in Fairmount, Philadelphia, on a Saturday morning, with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, working through projections for a fourth housing development she was considering. She was 37 years old. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater, and she had not slept particularly well, and by any external measure she looked like any other professional working quietly on a weekend morning. She was not recognizable. She was not famous. She had not been on a magazine cover or a podcast or a panel at a financial conference, not because those things weren't available to her, but because she did not find them interesting. What she found interesting was the legal pad in front of her and the numbers on it, and the question of whether those numbers could be made to do something useful for someone who needed them to. Her phone buzzed. It was Patricia Cole, texting about a meeting the following week. Elena replied, put her phone face down on the table, picked up her coffee, and looked out the window at the street. It was an ordinary Saturday morning. It was also, she was aware, the most extraordinary life she had ever imagined for herself, which was different from the most extraordinary life she had never imagined. That one was still being built. And somewhere on the other side of all of this, in a place Elena carried with her, the way you carry the people you love even after they're gone, she believed Rosa would have had something to say about all of it. Something brief, direct, slightly deflating in the way Rosa's comments always were, and then a small smile that she only ever gave when she thought you weren't looking. That smile was worth everything. It still was. There is a final note to this story, a small one, but the right one to end on. Among the documents Thomas Vasquez had left with Meridian Trust, there was a second envelope, one Gerald Marsh had not mentioned on that first day in the conference room, one that had not been part of the formal trust activation process, one that had sat in Meridian's archives for 26 years under the designation personal correspondence to be delivered at trustees' discretion upon full account transfer. Marsh had given it to Elena on the day she signed the final settlement paperwork, slipping it quietly across the table at the end of the meeting, the way you hand someone something you're not sure they're ready for, but you know they need. Elena had not opened it that day. She had carried it home in her bag and put it on her desk and looked at it for 2 weeks before she opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was taken in the summer of 1989 in what looked like a backyard somewhere, and in it was Rosa, young, mid-30s, laughing at something outside the frame, her hair loose, wearing a yellow dress. A more relaxed and unguarded than Elena had ever seen her mother look in any photograph she had ever found in their apartment. And beside Rosa, with his arm around her shoulders and an expression on his face that was somewhere between joy and an apology that had never quite been delivered, was a man Elena did not recognize but knew immediately. He was looking not at the camera, but at Rosa. He was looking at her the way you look at someone you have failed and still love, and are not sure you have the right to love anymore. On the back of the photograph, in Thomas Vasquez's handwriting, were 4 words. They were not an explanation. They were not a justification. They were just 4 words, the only ones he had apparently believed were necessary. They said, "She never gave up. Neither did Elena,